They say that legends never die, but these historical figures passed away not knowing their work would live forever. Welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we're counting down our picks for the top 10 people who became famous after they died. Before we begin, we publish new videos every day, so be sure to subscribe for more great content. For this list, we're looking at individuals throughout history who died in relative obscurity, but whose works, accomplishments, or feats went on to earn them significant fame after their deaths. We're not considering anyone who only became famous as a result of their demise, like victims of high-profile murders or sensational deaths. Also, some measure of success during their lifetime is acceptable, as long as their popularity after death clearly and substantially eclipses any name recognition they had in their lifetime. Number 10. Herman Melville. Long before Bear Grylls turned the idea of man versus wild into a freak show that involves sleeping inside camels, this 19th century American writer was exploring man's attempt to best nature in his novel Moby Dick.
As I live and breathe, he's mine.
Herman Melville briefly flirted with success as a writer after publishing his first book, Typee, a highly dramatized account of his time living among the Polynesians. But his subsequently published books, including Moby Dick, were increasingly less well-received, resulting in financial failure. His shift into poetry proved equally disastrous. By 1876, none of his books remained in print, and he died in 1891 as little more than a footnote in American literature.
Herman Melville wrote Moby Dick, and he was so poor and forgotten by the time he died that in his obituary, they called him Henry Melville.
In the early 1900s, however, his work resurfaced to retrospective acclaim, earning him a spot among America's great authors.
It will be a work of fiction, Mr. Nickerson.
Number 9. Gregor Mendel. Science and religion are often portrayed as being in direct conflict with each other, but for proof of potential harmony between the two, one need look no further than Gregor Mendel. This 19th century European scientist and friar studied plants and animals, and through crossbreeding established early concepts of heredity. Mendel is now considered to be the father of modern genetics. His work was largely dismissed by the scientific community in his own time, however, as it did not fit with current models. But by the early 1900s, a number of researchers revisited or rediscovered his works, and Mendel's laws went on to lay the foundation for what we now know as genetics. Number 8. Oscar Wilde. Similar to Melville, Oscar Wilde experienced some success and recognition during his lifetime. In the 1890s, after years spent as a journalist, editor, and author of essays, short stories, poetry, and fiction, he wrote a number of successful plays, including The Importance of Being Earnest, an instant hit.
I now realize for the first time in my life the vital importance of being earnest.
Despite his late career success, legal battles over his homosexuality resulted in him serving a 2-year prison sentence, after which he spent his final years as a penniless exile in France. Much of his work went unappreciated upon initial publishing, most notably The Picture of Dorian Gray, which was dismissed as immoral homoeroticism. But his collected works, life story, and poetically tragic death earned him significantly greater fame posthumously, a fame that grew exponentially in later decades.
Patriotism is the virtue of the vicious, according to Oscar Wilde.
Number 7. H.P. Lovecraft. Aside from Stephen King, there's likely no bigger name in horror than Lovecraft. But in his lifetime, the reclusive, self-conscious author never earned so much as a modest living from his written works, which were relegated to the pages of pulp magazines. His work was recognized within small circles of writers, however, and over the years, an appreciation of his writing by other authors in the genre went on to establish him as a father figure in horror culture. His influence has grown so great since his death that Lovecraftian horror is a subgenre of its very own.
Things much older than Earth are gazing upon us with indifference.
His creations and mythos, such as Cthulhu, have worked their way into the very fabric of pop culture and are now seen in anime, film, television, tabletop games, music, and video games.
The rise of Cthulhu from another dimension brings about 3,000 years of darkness, Tom.
Number 6. Edgar Allan Poe. Unappreciated though he was, Lovecraft often cited Poe as one of his major influences. Poe's work is particularly notable for being at once terrifying and yet undeniably beautiful, a rare quality in contemporary horror. He spent most of his adult life in relative poverty, supplementing his income by writing for journals and periodicals. This work earned him a reputation as a respected literary critic, but these circles were small. His only truly successful work in his own lifetime was The Raven.
And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore.
Posthumously, his poetry and short fiction work was translated into French, where it became quite popular, before spreading across the globe. Additionally, Poe is also credited with having invented the detective fiction genre, without ever naming it.
Brilliant! Yes!
Number 5. Galileo Galilei. The Inquisition. What a time to be alive.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition!
Galileo is a household name nowadays, but in his own lifetime, he was repeatedly subjected to censorship and forced to recant his scientific statements, spending the better part of his final decade under house arrest.
Galileo laid out his theories about the Earth revolving around the sun.
Gregor Mendel might have been the father of modern genetics, but Galileo has been called the father of science by the likes of Stephen Hawking and Albert Einstein.
Yes, science!
His contributions to the fields of astronomy, engineering, and physics were immeasurable. Sadly, during his own lifetime, the Church suppressed much of his work, deeming it heresy. In the years after his death, however, his banned works were steadily released, allowing the full impact of his discoveries to be felt by the scientific world. Number 4. Emily Dickinson. Although a few of Emily Dickinson's poems were published during her lifetime, they were heavily edited, and in some cases were even published anonymously. She was a prolific writer until her death at the age of 55, but kept the majority of her writings to herself.
I hear robins a great way off, and wagons a great way off.
After her death, her sister Lavinia discovered some 1,800 poems and made it her personal mission to see them published. A number of factors prevented this goal from being fully realized in the ensuing decades, but from 1890 to 1945, various edited volumes of her poetry were released, capturing the attention of critics. In 1955, her completed works were finally published. Since her death, Emily Dickinson has been recognized as one of the most important poets in American history.
Graham Greene, H.G. Wells. Sometimes Emily Dickinson.
Number 3. Johann Sebastian Bach. Johann Bach was certainly relatively well known in his own time, but not as a composer. Bach was a highly and widely respected professional organ player. He didn't keep his compositions a secret. They were simply considered too complex and too challenging for listeners of the musical arts. Interest in his music was limited to peers or contemporaries equally focused on pushing the boundaries of musical experimentation. Eventually, however, the world caught up to him. The early 19th century saw Bach rise in prominence as a composer, and with an 1829 performance of his sacred oratorio, St. Matthew Passion, he quickly grew into his current status as one of the greatest composers in history. Number 2. Vincent van Gogh. In his lifetime, Vincent van Gogh was a prolific painter, creating around 2,100 works in just over 10 years. But he only succeeded in selling a single painting in his own lifetime. Considered to be insane and a failure of an artist, partly because of that whole ear thing, he took his own life at the age of 37.
Yours truly, Vincent.
Post-death, in addition to his substantial contributions to modern art as we know it, his dramatic life and death have helped shape the romanticized depiction of the tortured artist, and the notion that one should suffer for their art. Before we unveil our number 1 pick, here are some honorable mentions.
Walden is antithetical to just about everything we think in the world now, you know?
Franz Kafka's stories do indeed deal with many mundane and absurd aspects of modern bureaucracy.
Are the creations of Stieg Larsson, a Swedish journalist and first-time novelist who didn't live to see the phenomenon his books would become.
Number 1. Anne Frank. Even on this list, Anne Frank is truly unique. She died at the tender age of 15 in a German concentration camp, and yet her writing, a simple diary, has gone on to become one of the most famous publications ever. Written between 1942 and 1944, it chronicles Anne's time in hiding with her family before their capture and transportation to Auschwitz. In her diary, which was recovered by her father, the only surviving member of her family after World War II, she wrote about her dreams of becoming a journalist. Although atrocious acts of genocide kept her from realizing that dream, the one piece of writing she did pen in her short life has made her one of the most famous non-fiction writers in history.
Do you agree with our picks? Check out these other great clips from WatchMojo and subscribe for new videos every day.